In April 1988, an intense 24-hour battle unfolded in the Persian Gulf, marking the end of one era of naval warfare and the dawn of another. This was Operation Praying Mantis, where the US Navy clashed with the Iranian Navy in the largest surface battle since World War II. What sparked this conflict, and how did the US Navy achieve such a decisive victory? To understand this monumental clash, we must journey back to the chaotic environment of the late 1980s. The Iran-Iraq War was raging, and the Persian Gulf had become a volatile battleground. Saddam Hussein's unprovoked invasion of Iran had escalated into a brutal stalemate, with both sides resorting to desperate measures, including chemical warfare and massive human wave attacks. In September 1980, Iraq launched an unprovoked invasion of Iran. Scholars and historians continue to debate the exact reasons why Saddam Hussein, Iraq's dictator, did this, but it was probably a combination of things. One of the primary reasons, and what was cited by Saddam publicly, was that he did not want either country to meddle in each other's affairs. For you see, once the Iranian Revolution of 1979 had occurred, powerful extremists had taken root in Iran and were interested in exporting their version of Islam to the world. Saddam, wanting Iraq to remain secular and nationalist-focused, did not want Iran stirring up trouble with Iraq's Shia minority, since he was already having problems with Kurds and could not afford issues with the much more numerous Shia Iraqis. Another major issue was land. In 1975, Iraq had signed what Saddam viewed as a very one-sided agreement about a border dispute over sea access on Iraq's small coastline with Iran. During this one-year war that preceded the agreement, Iraq's outdated military was defeated handily by Iranian formations. Since the agreement, Iran had also not handed over land to Iraq as promised, and 2 weeks before the invasion, Iraqi troops forcibly annexed the area stipulated as Iraqi land in the treaty. The last reason for Saddam to invade Iran was his desire to unseat Egypt as the leader of the Arab world. With Saddam so hell-bent on bolstering the power of the Iraqi military, which he did to great success in the 5 years leading up to the invasion, he saw Iran's weakness due to the execution, arrest, and exile of thousands of military officers and the degradation of Western equipment from sanctions as his opportunity to strike. With that, the Iran-Iraq war was on, but it was not the walk in the park that Saddam had thought. Though the Iraqis had made some good progress in their invasion of Iran, fanatical resistance, mountainous terrain, and the survival of most key Iranian equipment in the opening salvos slowed and then halted Iraq's invasion. In the coming 18 months, the Iranians pushed back the Iraqis across the international border, and the war entered a vicious stalemate. During the stalemate that ensued, both sides looked for ways to tip the edge of the war in each other's favor. Before long, both were using chemical weapons against one another, as well as Iran creating ad hoc formations of fanatical volunteers that included teenagers as young as 12 and men as old as 80. These new units, known as the Basi, were a desperate measure by Iran to send literal human waves of poorly armed attackers to slowly grind the Iraqis down. The tactics slowly worked, but at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. As the war continued on with no end in sight, Iraq sought to open a new front in the war by attacking Iranian shipping and oil infrastructure in the Gulf. While attacks started in 1980, they did not pick up until 1984, when Iraqi warplanes began targeting the central and southern Persian Gulf instead of just the northern part. Once Iraq had expanded its war to the entire Gulf, Iran began to respond to Iraqi attacks in kind. While Iraq mainly relied on its air power, due to being almost landlocked, Iran utilized planes, ships, thousands of improvised fast attack craft, and mines to wage war against Iraq. But who was Iran targeting? Due to Iraq being almost landlocked, it relied heavily on oil pipelines throughout Kuwait, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia to carry its oil and then embark on tankers, which could then take the oil to market. Because of this practice, Iran began targeting increasing numbers of tankers carrying Iraqi oil in the region, especially those leaving from Kuwait. But events on the ground would take a turn for the worse for neutral shipping in the region. In February 1986, Iranian troops captured the Al-Faw Peninsula in southern Iraq. Not only did this capture of Iraqi territory cut off Iraq from the sea for good and destroy the prestige of Saddam's army, but it also gave the Iranians a convenient shooting platform from which to fire silkworm missiles and other weapons at Kuwaiti tankers, leaving the country with near impunity. Due to the uptick of attacks, Kuwait turned to the international community for help, but who did they ask? At first, Kuwait approached the Soviets and asked if Kuwaiti ships could be reflagged as Soviet ships and enjoy the protection of its navy. The USSR happily agreed to this measure, as the Soviets were always looking to increase their presence in the Middle East by any means necessary. But of course, the US would not allow this to occur. Instead, after consulting with his defense advisors, President Reagan declared that the US would reflag Q-80 tankers under the US flag and that they would enjoy the protection of the US Navy for the duration of the war. Of course, this bold statement left many questions unanswered for the military about how, when, and where to conduct defensive operations. Navy leadership at first wondered what the strategic objectives of such a plan could be. The president's administration answered this question publicly, that any time a Q-80 vessel transited the Persian Gulf from one end to another without incident was the definition of mission success. However, how US Navy vessels would protect themselves and now US-flagged vessels was still open to interpretation and would only have those questions answered during what became known as Operation Earnest Will. Operation Earnest Will began in July 1987, but the operation began in earnest on May 17, 1987. That night, the guided missile frigate USS Stark was conducting a routine patrol in the Persian Gulf. During this time, Operation Earnest Will had just been officially announced as going into effect in July. For the time being, the US maintained a presence in the Middle East to deter attacks on neutral shipping in the region, but that night, this routine patrol became anything but. On that fateful evening, the crew of the Stark was settling into their evening routine of box ops and maintaining an air and surface picture of all belligerent and neutral contacts in the area. Around 10 o'clock at night, the crew noticed an Iraqi jet take off and start heading south towards them. However, a full-scale war was going on and Iraqi jets operated all the time. The crew merely needed to track and report its movements. That was until it did something different. After traveling about 50 miles, the plane made a sharp left turn. With its new course, the plane was headed directly toward the Stark. Despite a negative response to hails and queries, the crew did not take any other evasive action until it was too late. At around 20 miles away, the Iraqi jet launched 2 Exocet missiles at the Stark. Due to a radar casualty, it was not apparent that this had occurred. Only when a lookout visually saw the missiles 2 miles away did the ship take evasive action. As the captain ordered the Stark to turn hard to starboard to unmask her close-in weapon system, the ship took the first missile about 4 seconds later. However, this missile did not detonate, but the second one 30 seconds later did. In the ensuing inferno, 37 of her crew died and 21 were badly wounded. Firefighting efforts lasted throughout the night, and she was barely able to limp back to port in Bahrain for emergency repairs before departing the region. While the root causes and what happened in the immediate aftermath remain a hotly debated and controversial historical debate, its effect on US temperament towards the war was profound. Though the plane that struck the Stark was Iraqi, US leadership knew that the conflict has now taken a strategic shift. This was the first time that a US warship had been damaged and sailors killed during the war so far. Despite the US not condemning Iraq due to wanting to support the country with its war against Iran, the US still saw Iran as the more significant threat. Instead, the Reagan administration used this tragedy to galvanize its support base in the military that a much larger US presence was needed to deter future acts of aggression. This set the stage for the huge military force that followed, which saw the increase of the Middle East force, which eventually became today's Fifth Fleet, from a force of around 7 ships to over 30. The reason for the large uptick in ships was the need to escort ships. These escorts worked as follows. Before transiting the Strait of Hormuz, ships would assemble in the Gulf of Oman to meet with their escorts. Once communications had been established and everyone knew the plan, the convoy would then head north through the Strait of Hormuz and into the Gulf to whichever port they were going to. On the return trip, escorts inside the Gulf would then assemble the ships and took them back the way they came. And while this sounds simple enough, it was anything but, as the very first US convoy proved. On July 22, 1987, the first convoy of Earnest Will left to head north. Consisting of 3 warships and 2 tankers, including the 400,000-ton former Q-80 tanker renamed the Bridgeton, the trip seemed to be going all right until the convoy just left the Strait of Hormuz. Just north of this choke point, as the Bridgeton's captain described it, a giant shudder rocked the whole ship, an impressive feat for such a large vessel. After taking stock of what happened, it soon became apparent that the Bridgeton had struck a mine and had a 15-foot hole in her hull. Fortunately, the Bridgeton was heading north and was therefore empty and not loaded down with crude oil. Once this happened, the protectors in the convoy became protected and all changed course to be behind the Bridgeton. With very little mine warfare capabilities, this convoy was a sitting duck, and the Iranians knew it. Fortunately, no further attacks happened and the ships got to port in Kuwait, but there was just one problem. Though it was very clear the Bridgeton had struck a mine, it was not clear whose it was. Even though Iraq claimed through both official channels and backdoor conversations that they were not mining the Gulf, suspicion fell squarely on Iran. However, with the regime claiming they had not done so, and with no evidence to the contrary, the US could not blame Iran then. However, this attack greatly altered the course of the operation. After the Bridgeton was hit, the US Navy really focused on hunting mines in the region. As part of these efforts, the Navy recommissioned 5 retired minesweepers back into service and flew in another 8 CH-53 Sea Stallions, which are helicopters designed to hunt mines. The Navy also increased the number of helicopters on deployed ships in the region that could carry mine-detecting arrays, and also added Army Special Forces and SEAL teams to help board mine-laying vessels. And if that were not enough, the Navy created 2 floating helicopter bases after being denied basing rights to have 24/7 helicopter coverage in the region. With all of these assets in the region, it was only a matter of time until the US caught Iran in the act of laying mines, and that came in September. Late that evening, around a shallow shipping channel northeast of Bahrain, a US ship was on a routine patrol when her crew spotted something odd through night vision goggles. In the distance, they saw what looked like a fishing trawler suddenly turn all its lights off. Then the crew could clearly see that people on deck were preparing mines to be thrown over the side. With this visual sighting of mine laying in the act, the crew quickly launched 2 US Army MH-6 helicopters flown by Special Forces warrant officers whose sole mission was to hunt down mine-laying ships. Once airborne, the 2 helos quickly fell on their prey. As the crew was still actively throwing mines into the water, the helicopters opened fire with their miniguns. Once the helos had made their first pass, they made another, this time firing their 3.75-inch rocket pods filled with fletchet darts that pierced through flesh and steel like it was nothing. As the helicopters made their second pass, the crew on board the ship could clearly see the other crew jumping into the water to save their lives. But instead of boarding an unknown hostile vessel at night, higher headquarters had the sailors stand by until a SEAL team could be brought to the area and conduct the boarding in the morning. What they found helped set the stage for what was to come that following spring. Once aboard the vessel, the SEALs found out that the ship was an Iranian-flagged vessel called the Iranian. Besides plucking both dead and alive Iranian crew from the ship and the waters around it, the SEALs discovered a critical clue that poked a giant hole in everything Iran had been saying about mining. On deck, the hapless crew had abandoned 9 naval mines in various stages of being armed. The serial numbers and lot numbers on the mines proved they were of Iranian origin. But despite this damning evidence, the Reagan administration decided that they still needed to show some more restraint. That was until another event a month later. After Iran had captured the Al-Faw Peninsula, they began regularly targeting vessels leaving Kuwait with Silkworm missiles. On October 15, 1987, a previously escorted US-flagged supertanker called the Sea Isle City was getting underway from Kuwait. Once in open ocean, she would then meet up with their American escort ships to transit the Persian Gulf, but she would not make it there. As the Sea Isle City was just getting out of port, she was hit in her bridge by an Iranian Silkworm missile. The blast blinded the ship's captain and wounded 18 other crew members. Once the word got out about the attack, Reagan finally decided that action must be taken, but wanted a limited-scale attack. This event would be codenamed Operation Nimble Archer. In trying to decide the target for the attack, the US chose a derelict oil platform in the southern Persian Gulf. But why would the US pick such a target? Because Iran's naval capability was limited, the Revolutionary Guard Corps and Navy worked together to man derelict oil and natural gas platforms throughout the Gulf. These platforms were bristling with radars, communication equipment, and air defense systems to track all shipping in the region and shoot down Iraqi aircraft. The information gleaned from these lookout stations would be passed along to shore-based missile sites that were firing at merchant vessels. Reagan, on advice from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, decided on a limited operation to destroy one of these lookout posts to send a message to stop doing this. The task force assembled for the mission included 6 US warships and accompanying air cover. Their orders were to go up to the platform, give the Iranians time to evacuate, and then destroy it with naval gunfire. But the plan didn't exactly go that way. As the Americans came up to the platform, the Iranians heeded the radio warning and left. Once the US ships saw the Iranians leave, they began firing high-explosive shells. However, after more than 1,000 rounds, the platform remained standing. To finish the job, a squad of explosive ordnance disposal technicians boarded the platform, packed it with explosive charges, and set it off. In the words of one officer who witnessed the event, the platform simply disappeared in the massive explosion. After Operation Nimble Archer, things began to quiet down for a bit. Though Iranian attacks on US ships stopped, Iran continued to up its attacks against other neutral shipping. As a result, the convoys began to get bigger and bigger, as sometimes dozens of unaligned vessels forced their way into US formations to be protected against Iranian attacks. This environment of fear is where the US found itself until that fateful day of April 14, 1988, which would be the event that set in motion Operation Praying Mantis. On that fateful day, the guided missile frigate Samuel B. Roberts was steaming in a southerly direction when, all of a sudden, one of her lookouts spotted something off her bow. Unsure exactly what it was, the ship slackened her speed and inched closer to investigate. Due to the fact that many merchants shipped live animals in the area and frequently threw dead ones overboard, the crew at first thought the object might be a dead sheep or goat. However, as the Sammy B, as she was affectionately known, got closer, the crew realized they were in fact in a minefield. Knowing that the best course of action was to reverse the way they came, the captain ordered the Sammy B to slowly back out of the minefield. However, as she did so, a terrible explosion rocked the ship. Unknown to the crew, a 25-foot hole was now in the bottom of the ship. The blast had actually broken the ship in half and knocked its engines off their mounts. What happened next is the stuff of damage control legend. To save the ship, the crew literally held it together with cables to keep the two halves together. The engineers valiantly kept power on throughout the ship the whole time, and the ship had its entire combat system suite ready to fire against any other Iranian threats. Though 10 sailors were wounded in the blast, the ship managed to make it to Bahrain under her own power. But how did the US know it was an Iranian mine that Sammy B struck? In the days after the incident, Iranian vessels began searching for mines to pluck out of the water before the Americans could find them. However, they were not good enough since the US was still able to send teams that collected several mines in the area. The serial numbers and make of these mines matched the ones recovered from the Iran-Najjar the previous fall. With clear concrete proof that these had been Iranian mines, the US knew that something drastic had to be done. And what the Reagan administration decided to do next set the two countries on a collision course for a fight. As soon as the president got confirmation that Iran had been the culprit in this most recent attack, he assembled his defense team at Camp David to come up with a plan. During initial conversations, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Admiral Crowe proposed that the US sink an Iranian warship. The one he had in mind was the Iranian frigate Sabalan. Commanded by an Iranian officer nicknamed Captain Nasty, the ship was famous for forcing merchant vessels to stop, searching the ship, and then shooting up the bridge and other parts of the ship with gunfire. Before leaving, Captain Nasty would tell the merchants to have a nice day. However, Captain Nasty would have Lady Luck on his side, as the other members in the room talked Reagan out of doing this. Instead, the course of action chosen for the operation would be to eliminate the Sasan and Siri platforms. But President Reagan gave a strict caveat. If the Iranian Navy dared venture to meet US ships, they could sink them. With that, Operation Praying Mantis was a go. As far as how to conduct the operation, the Middle East Force commander divided his 9 ships into 3 surface action groups, or SAGs. Each SAG was given a specific task. SAG Bravo was in charge of destroying the Sasan platform. SAG Charlie was to eliminate the Siri platform, and SAG Delta was to hang back and defend against any Iranian ships that sortied out of port to meet the US force. The attack on the Sasan platform at 6 o'clock that morning kicked off the day's events. After breakfast, US sailors went to general quarters at 7 o'clock in preparation for the attack. Once the ships were all manned and ready for battle, the Americans broadcast a warning over the radio in both English and Farsi that in 30 minutes, the platform would be blown up. With that warning, there was a flurry of activity on the platform. The US sailors could hear the Iranians frantically calling back to Tehran asking for orders. They begged the Americans for more time, but they refused. At 8:04 a.m., 30 minutes on the dot, US ships began lobbing 5-inch airburst rounds into the platform. The very first round that hit the platform struck just above the ZSU anti-air gun the Iranians were manning and wiped them out. After a few more shells, the Iranians got back on the radio and said they were evacuating. US forces watched as the Iranians scrambled down ladders onto a waiting tugboat while helping some of the wounded survivors down. Once the tug left, a helicopter came in and fast-roped a squad of Marines onto the platform, who cleared it and collected any intelligence they could find. They then set explosive charges and left. Once safely back on board, the Americans blew up the platform. It was now SAG Charlie's turn to get some action. After setting general quarters at 7 in the morning, the SAG began circling the Siri platform. Once all crews were manned and ready, the ships began issuing a warning at 7:55 that in 5 minutes they would start shooting and for the Iranians to evacuate. Most of the Iranians on board heeded this warning and began immediately evacuating. Because of this, the SAG commander ordered the ships to hold fire for now to give them more time to leave. However, after 35 minutes of waiting and some Iranians still standing fast to their guns, the US ships opened fire with 5-inch shells and 76mm gunfire. Unlike the Sasan platform, the Iranians returned fire for several minutes. However, when a 5-inch shell hit a compressed gas tank, the resulting inferno incinerated the gun crew. When that happened, the surviving Iranians gave up, and their tug came back to pick up the rest. With the platform now engulfed in a fiery inferno, it was not necessary to send in the SEAL team to finish the job with explosives. But where was the Iranian Navy? Back in Tehran, Iranian leadership was furious. In their mind, one of two things had just happened. The first was that the US had severely damaged Iran's prestige, and there must be a retaliation for that. The other was a much deeper-rooted fear. By happenstance, on the exact same day as Operation Praying Mantis, the Iraqi army launched a major offensive to recapture the Al-Faw Peninsula. Believing that the US had now officially entered the war on Iraq's side against Iran, hardliner Iranian leadership now considered the US an equal belligerent and sought to do battle. Regardless of the reason, the first surface engagement would not be too long after the destruction of the Siri platform. As SAG Charlie continued to circle the Siri platform, nearby helicopters spotted what appeared to be an Iranian warship heading straight toward the force. As the vessel got closer, ships in SAG Charlie began picking up emissions from the unknown high-speed contact. Intelligence confirmed that the ship was indeed an Iranian warship. The 154-foot patrol craft that was barreling down on the force was the Jashan. Though much smaller than the other US warships present, the Jashan packed a serious punch. Armed with a 76mm gun, the same as the American frigates, along with a 40mm gun and crew-served weapons, the ship was bristling with firepower. But that was not the only thing she carried. On her stern, the Jashan had several American Harpoon missiles. These anti-ship missiles could deal a ton of damage and were the main battery on board. As the Jashan continued to barrel towards the USS Wainwright, the lead ship in the SAG, the Americans began calling out warning after warning for Jashan to stop what she was doing, change course, and stay away from the group. The crew of the Jashan were unfazed by all these warnings. Finally, as she was almost over the top of the Wainwright, the US force gave one last warning, ordering them to abandon the ship as the US would fire on them. But Jashan got in the first shot. As soon as the warning went out, the Jashan fired a Harpoon missile straight at the Wainwright. Her crew took immediate evasive action by coming about and launching chaff. These are superheated chunks of metal aimed to attract the missile seeker, and it worked, just barely. As the missile from Jashan flew towards the Wainwright, the bridge team could feel the heat of its propellant as it soared overhead, missing the Wainwright by mere feet and splashing harmlessly 75 yards away. At this moment, the Wainwright and a sister ship, the Simpson, fired an SM-1 in surface mode toward the Jashan. The first missile obliterated Jashan's superstructure, while the other hit her amidships. In total, the SAG fired 4 standard missiles into her, and all 4 were hits. As the Jashan was ablaze from stem to stern, the Middle East Force Admiral contacted the Pentagon to inform them of what had happened. Admiral Crowe ordered the US force to close with the Jashan and sink her. As the force closed in, a helicopter above helped adjust the ship's fire due to the intense amount of smoke. The helo told the group to cease fire after the first initial salvo of 5-inch rounds that hit the Jashan. When questioned, the pilots confirmed that the Jashan had slipped beneath the waves, with all that was left of her burning oil slicks and dead Iranian sailors. Once the Jashan had sunk, the sailors of SAG Charlie began wondering if they would then pick up the survivors. Ultimately, the commander decided not to, figuring that if they approached the site, the Iranians would claim that the Americans had machine-gunned the survivors. They would still claim this later, but due to the time it took to make this decision, several Iranian F-4 Phantoms began approaching fast. The US force warned the approaching Iranian aircraft to remain clear, however they did not listen and kept coming towards them. As a result, the Wainwright fired 2 SM-1s in air mode towards the approaching aircraft. One of them scored a hit, and the broken aircraft limped back to base, missing part of its wing. Once the aircraft had left, a period of calm settled over SAG Charlie. They had now been in combat for over 10 hours and were exhausted. During this relative calm, the crew realized something was wrong. A Marine Corps Cobra that had refueled on Wainwright earlier in the afternoon was overdue. The helo would eventually be reported missing, and several months after the battle, the US would locate and recover the wreckage. Though there is still a debate to this day, the pilots probably suffered a sense of vertigo when taking evasive maneuvers to avoid Iranian fire and crashed into the sea. They would be the only American casualties of the operation. Though this was the end of the fighting for SAG Charlie, for SAG Bravo, their day was now heating up too, or so they thought. As SAG Charlie was engaging the Jashan, the ships of SAG Bravo were investigating radar contacts when one piqued their interest. In the distance, there was a fast-moving warship going 25 knots. The USS Merrill sent up a Marine helicopter to investigate and asked if they could confirm the ship visually. However, the Marines had to keep a safe distance to be out of danger from air-to-air fire should the ship turn out to be Iranian. The SAG commander grew frustrated that the Marine pilots could not positively identify the ship and asked them to get closer. However, the senior Marine commander did not want to endanger his pilots. Soon, however, the pilots radioed back and said they could see a 3-digit hull number but could not make it out. The sailors on Meryl began scrambling for information to see what Iranian ship it could be. However, according to their sources, there was not a single Iranian ship with a 3-digit hull number. Not wanting to risk shooting someone else by accident, the SAG commander held his fire. It ended up being the right call, since as the ship closed in within 3,000 yards of the force, the crew could see it was a Soviet cruiser. When asked what they were doing and why they had not responded before, the cruiser responded in a heavy accent. "We want to take pictures of history." With that, the Soviet cruiser continued on taking pictures, not realizing it almost became another Jashan. But where was the rest of the Iranian Navy? SAG Delta had spent all morning prosecuting potential surface contacts and looking for the Iranian surface fleet, to no avail. However, aircraft from the USS Enterprise, which was in the Gulf of Oman, were conducting patrols in the southern Persian Gulf. When they got word that several Iranian Boghammers, specially made light fast attack craft, were harassing an oil platform and had shot up several merchant vessels. Unsure if they could attack the vessels so close to Iranian territorial waters, the pilots asked for permission to engage, which went up through the Strike Group Admiral, the Midyaspor Admiral, and up to Colin Powell, and then to President Reagan, and back all within 3 minutes. And what was the president's response? Shoot them. With that, the American A-6 intruders engaged the Boghammers, sinking one and forcing the rest to run aground Bandar Abbas. But the fight was not over yet. Soon after taking out the Boghammers, the American jets began seeing what looked like a Psalm-class frigate heading towards them. Figuring that this was the prized Sabalan with Captain Nasty on board, the planes were ordered to investigate the ship and confirm it was Iranian due to SAG Bravo's close call with a Soviet cruiser. As the American jets got closer, one of the A-6s volunteered to fly low over the ship. Though it was not the Sabalan, the pilot confirmed it was its sister ship, the Sahand. However, as the pilot flew over the ship, her crew responded with a fury of anti-aircraft fire and shot a missile at the plane. The pilot counterattacked by flying back around and firing a harpoon, several rockets, and a 500-pound bomb. The damage was considerable. By the time SAG Delta arrived on the scene, the Sahand was already a burning hulk. It didn't stand a chance. As the 3 ships of the SAG and 7 more aircraft closed in on her, the US forces began pumping missile after missile into her. In total, the Sahand took 12 direct missile hits and sunk within a matter of minutes. But where was the Sabalan? Unknown to the Americans, the captain of the Sabalan put her to sea to try and fight the US upon hearing of the loss of their sister ship. Getting underway from Bandar Abbas, it was not long before those same fighter jets that had helped sink the Sahand found the Sabalan lurking near the Strait of Hormuz. As the A-6 piloted by Lieutenant Commander James Engler flew in close to visually identify the ship, the crew of Sabalan sent up a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Now for sure that this was the Sabalan, Lieutenant Commander Engler expertly flew his aircraft over top of the ship and dropped a single 500-pound bomb down on one of her stacks. This stack led directly to one of the main engine rooms, and the resulting explosion was catastrophic. Witnesses reported that the entire hull of the Sabalan bulged outward and then back in. The ship's stern was underwater, and fires raged everywhere because of this single decisive strike. With the Sabalan now a sitting duck, the rest of SAG Delta was en route to finish her off. But that would not be the case. Sensing that all proportionality had now gone out the window, Admiral Crowe consulted with his fellow chiefs of staff and recommended to President Reagan that US forces not sink the Sabalan, which might continue to escalate the fighting further. Wanting to give Iran a way out of this, President Reagan ordered all surface and air units to cease fire and give Iran some breathing space. For Iran's part, they readily took the opportunity to save the Sabalan, which was taken under tow and eventually returned to service. With this order, Operation Praying Mantis was now officially over. Though the Gulf remained incredibly tense for the next few days, there was no further fighting. Despite not stopping Iranian attacks on neutral shipping, the US taught Iran a very valuable lesson that day. If the US decided to, they could annihilate Iranian conventional forces in short order. What do you think about the tactics used in Operation Praying Mantis? Do you believe the US Navy's actions were justified in response to the Iranian threats? How do you think modern naval warfare strategies have evolved since then? Let us know your thoughts and any questions you have in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth military analysis.